looks like one of the producers for Final Fantasy VII is having some regrets and embarrassment about the previous installment of Final Fantasy VII, or at least the version that came out in the 1990s. And of course, this makes sense if you're thinking about the modern social pressures that are going up against all these video game and entertainment properties that produce content for a time where people were less sensitive. And I think Final Fantasy is a product of that time, where some of the dialogue choices, some of the, I guess, interactions with different characters weren't sensitive to what would happen in the future. And I think this is the producer for Final Fantasy realizing, okay, societal changes happen. People might be angry at some of the comments we made in the previous games, and it might bring that back up. So Final Fantasy producer, the current producer who worked on the original Final Fantasy VII game, he's a bit embarrassed with some of the statements. He talks about the whole development process that he regrets, but I think the development process led to the best Final Fantasy game in Final Fantasy VII, so how could you regret that process? But he said there was a lot of people inserting different pieces of dialogue in there that weren't 100% checked. It was more freewheeling, it was less restrictions on the creativity of the individuals in the studio, and I think that actually led to a good process of developing something that was pretty interesting, engaging, and it actually made a phenomenon of the entire Final Fantasy genre, at least in the USA. So I think it's a strategy that worked, but he regrets it now, because I think the social and societal pressures that are pushing back against anything of that time, when people were more open to using words and having perspectives that are against the grain, that is not the society we live in today. You have to be uniform and have a uniform thought process, and I think this is him trying to find safety by saying he's embarrassed by it, and he may be naturally embarrassed by it because other people are saying this is unsatisfactory, unsavory commentary in your game and you produced it, so you must be a bad guy. And I think that is the situation that's happening all over entertainment, where people are accusing everyone of being the bad guy for their past content. We see that happening with the video game industry. We see that with think pieces talking about Tomb Raider, talking about all these older games and how they presented women, or how they used different dialogue strategies that kind of misrepresented cultures. And I think he's under that backlash where he's getting pressured about his past games. I think that's the case for Final Fantasy VII, where he's getting embarrassed because everyone is bringing this up. And I think mainly games journalists who are the most unreputable piece of the video game industry, because no one really cares what they think, and their opinions are usually from a place of people that really don't play games. So I think that is the power of game journalists right now. Even though a lot of gamers really don't like them or listen to them, they do influence the developers, and I think that's what's happening with Final Fantasy VII. I think, of course, they have their own outside investors that are pushing for this, I guess, these more modern takes for the audiences, and that is another pressure that's been happening with Square Enix and all these other Japanese companies that are producing content for the USA. They're being pressured by US companies to adapt to modern audiences, and I think that's what's happening with Final Fantasy VII. The producer, he's trying to adapt to modern audiences, and he's trying to show that he's changing his perspective. And I think that's what we saw with the most recent Final Fantasy game that came out. They tried to adapt to modern social norms in America, and even that wasn't enough. People were accusing them of presenting a monoculture without any diversity, with their focus on European Germanic culture in their recent Final Fantasy release, and its perspective on slavery. People were just constantly attacking them because they didn't go far enough. And I think that's the problem with a lot of the modern day journalists, game journalists. They're always going to attack you until you go 100% on their side. It can't be haphazard. It can't be a compromise. And I think this is where Final Fantasy's producer is going to find fault in this action, because you can never go far enough for these game journalists, and the people that play the games, they don't really care what the game journalists say. So until these producers of these games realize the journalists have no effect on your game, I think they're still going to be influenced by these game journalists. I think that is the main thing that is leading to this producer to say this, is because he sees all the pieces written in America. He's thinking, okay, all the Americans think like this, when most video game players don't listen to game journalists. They listen more to YouTube influencers or Twitch streamers more than anyone else. So they're not going to listen to a random person writing up some journalistic critique on a video game they never played and probably didn't even watch the trailer for. So it is showing that strong influence here for the game journalists, and I think that's why they're still dangerous to a certain extent, because developers still think they have value when they actually don't have value. But let's look at some of the cultural depictions that he's talking about. We have, of course, the most famous scene from the original Final Fantasy VII, where some guy was being an abusive husband. He was telling his wife to get some tea for the guests, called her a B word. So of course that's just depicting I think a regular abusive person in a marriage. So it makes sense to me that he says this, but of course he's thinking, okay, we can't even have bad guys be bad because modern audiences are too sensitive to bad guys. So the bad guys have to still have modern political takes that are in line with the party that is supporting these games. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Let bad guys be bad. And I think that's a problem with a lot of the modern storytelling, is where they try to make the bad guys still have some sort of morality and sensibility that is in line with their own political thought, when the bad guys are supposed to be bad. They're not meant to be in line with the political thought. But of course that's just the modern day storytelling tactics, where everything is about sending a message, even if it gets in the way of the story. And I think that is the case here with a lot of the villains that are being made today, where everyone wants the villain to be sympathetic, they want him to be moral, they want him to have the equal grounding with the hero, where I'm like, no, the bad guy is supposed to be evil, the bad guy is supposed to be bad. Let him be bad, let them be bad, let them show the poor qualities you're not supposed to be. And they're fearful of that for some reason in modern day storytelling. I think that is the thing that's going to affect Final Fantasy if they do follow these modern audience takes. Of course, you have this one using words that are deemed inappropriate. This says, would you stop acting like an R word and climb up? And I remember this one specifically. I just laughed at this when I was younger, but now the R word is now deemed as a terrible word. You can't say that. It became an insult eventually, and that has led to people deeming it as some evil word to say. And I think this is just the evolving times. I don't think it's anything that it should be seen as a gross miscarriage of justice here by using that word. And I think that's the main thing that we're seeing here with these developers. They're just feeling pressure from journalists, and I think to a higher extent their investment firms that are placing money into their company, and they're forcing them to hire these groups of people for ESG standards, to follow these standards. And these people that they hire are pointing out these small details of old games and asking them to apologize and asking them to feel this pressure when it's unnecessary. No one really cares about these aspects of the games, especially the people that are playing these games and looking forward to these games. And I think that is the case here. Of course, you have two women fighting. They're going to edit that out probably, because it's just it doesn't represent women in the right way. And I think this is the type of thing we're probably going to see within the next half of the Final Fantasy game. I think that is a sad part, because I like the overall upgrade of Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it's going to be missing a lot of the funny and enjoyable parts that were slipped into the game. And I think that was a beautiful creative process they once had with Final Fantasy VII. It was unpredictable, of course, it was unsteady, so they changed it up afterwards. That's what the producer says, but I think it led to their best game ever. So I don't know if you want to change a process that is almost golden. But tell me what you think about the situation, about the Final Fantasy producer being embarrassed and regretting some of the parts and pieces of the original Final Fantasy VII. You think it's social pressure from games journalists, or investment pressure, or do you think he's really embarrassed? Leave your thoughts, like, share, subscribe. This is Wagner Knows Why. Catch you next time.